So here's an apologetics riddle for you. If you've got good evidence that the Gospels is historically reliable, why would you try and convince folks not to even look at it? Hey there, folks. Bert from the Barely Bearable Atheist here, continuing our series on the book On Guard by Dr. William Lane Craig. We's up to Chapter 8 entitled, Who is Jesus? And Dr. Craig has promised us that at some point between 1970 and 2010, some unnamed scholars has done some unspecified research that revolutionized the field of New Testament studies. According to him, skeptical scholarship has been marginalized, and a growing consensus of scholars has decided that the original New Testament documents is reliable history. But the devil, as they say, is in the details, and the more we get into Chapter 8, the more apparent it becomes that Dr. Craig has an agenda. He wants his readers to think not just that the New Testament is historically reliable, but that it's the only historically reliable source for information about Jesus and his supposed resurrection. He ain't just stacking the deck, he's throwing away most of the cards. Because if you can control what folks can see, you can steer what they believe. And that's what apologetics is all about. But that's enough intro. Let's get into Chapter 8. He just got done saying that historians look at the New Testament documents the same way as they look at other ancient documents, which is true, and that historians is deciding whether or not these documents is reliable, which is false. Historians know that ancient documents ain't never entirely true nor entirely false. The whole job of the historian is to sift through the claims in each document, trying to separate fact from fiction. Because every document is most likely going to be a mixture of both, whether intentionally or not. And we ought to approach ancient documents like the New Testament with exactly the same attitude. Also, genuine historians look at lots of other documents as well, and not just the New Testament. Dr. Craig knows that, and he don't like it, so he's about to steer us so as we don't follow their example. Quote, "It's important to understand that originally there wasn't any such book called the New Testament. There were just these separate documents handed down from the first century." End quote. It's also important to understand that these documents was preceded by years or even decades of oral tradition. Some of these oral traditions was written down in the 4 canonical Gospels, and others was recorded in non-canonical Gospels. But oral traditions was the foundation of the Christian faith in the first century. And by the way, when I say oral tradition, I don't mean that none of it was ever referred to in writing. I just mean that the teachings of the church was passed on primarily by direct person-to-person communication, as in fact it still is today, even in Protestant churches. Historians understand that the significance of both the canonical and non-canonical documents is that they gives us insights into what these oral traditions was, which is why it's important, at least for historians, to take all of the ancient documents into consideration, and not just limit yourself to the official canon. But Dr. Craig don't want us to do that. Quote, "It wasn't until a couple centuries later that the church officially collected all these documents under one cover, which came to be known as the New Testament." End quote. And that's a pretty sloppy summary of the actual history of the New Testament canon. The earliest canon was the one proposed by Marcion around 140 CE, and it contained only a modified version of Luke and 10 of the letters attributed to Paul. It didn't even have the Old Testament. So that's roughly 110 years after Jesus died. And you might think, gosh, over a century with no New Testament canon? That's a long time for a scripture-based religion to go without having any official definition of which books was scripture. But that's because we tend to look at Christianity in the context of the Protestant Reformation, which didn't happen until the 1500s. Christianity in the first century weren't scripture-based. it was based on oral tradition, or what the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches call apostolic tradition. And if you think about it, that makes sense. First century Christians believed that Jesus was going to come back and the end of the world was going to happen in their own lifetimes, and maybe even today or tomorrow. And that means spreading the gospel is urgent. It can't wait. You got to get the word out, and the best way to do that is by word of mouth. They didn't have no way to mass-produce books, and copying books out by hand was a labor-intensive and time-consuming process, which made books too expensive for ordinary folks to afford. And even once you had a book, you still had to physically deliver it to folks, which meant carrying it to wherever they was. And once you got there, you found out that a lot of folks was illiterate, or they didn't speak the language the book was written in, so they couldn't use a written book anyway. So you didn't have no incentive to go to all that trouble. Instead of carrying books around, just go and take them the story in verbal form. That's why Paul went on missionary journeys instead of sitting down and writing the gospel according to Paul. Time was of the essence, and word of mouth was the quickest way to spread it in the culture of the time. But, of course, none of that is going to help Dr. Craig sell us his narrative about God giving the church an official New Testament scripture that the church was only given formal acknowledgement of later on. So he just sticks to the official story. Quote, the church chose only the earliest sources, which were closest to Jesus and the original disciples, to include in the New Testament, and left out later secondary accounts like the forged apocryphal Gospels, which everyone knew were fakes. End quote. Now bear in mind that the 27 books in today's New Testament was canonized at the Council of Hippo in the year 393 CE. Prior to that point, there was a bunch of documents that Christians referred to as Scripture, and some of them books was pretty consistently recognized as being such, but there weren't any universal consensus saying that specifically these 27 books was genuine and the others was all fakes. There's lots of other books like the Didache and the Shepherd of Hermas and such that was also being quoted as Scripture. And the New Testament book of Jude even quotes from the apocryphal book of Enoch and Assumption of Moses as if they were Scripture. So this notion that God gave the church a set of distinctively authentic New Testament scriptures and that the rest was all clearly fakes is what we might charitably call a highly biased Protestant retcon. During the first 3 or 4 centuries, there weren't no such clear-cut distinction, and folks was frequently debating over which books exactly was genuine Scripture. And that makes sense when we remember that Scripture weren't the foundation of the early church, oral tradition was. And maybe Dr. Craig is aware at some level of the weakness of his rendition of the supposed history of the New Testament canon, so he calls in a strawman for support. Quote, people who insist on evidence taken only from the writings outside the New Testament don't understand what they're asking us to do. They're demanding that we ignore the earliest primary sources about Jesus in favor of sources that are later, secondary, and less reliable, which is just crazy as historical methodology. End quote. Now, I don't reckon I need to point out the fact that ain't nobody, and I mean nobody, arguing that we ought to ignore the New Testament documents completely and get our information exclusively from later, non-canonical sources. Dr. Craig's trying to make it sound like historians is somehow excluding any consideration of New Testament sources, as if historians was, possessed by demons or something and it can't stand the sight of actual scriptures. But, of course, that ain't at all what's going on. What Dr. Craig is so upset about is the fact that historians look at all the ancient documents and not just the ones officially blessed by a bunch of bishops in 393 CE. Because when you do that, you get a broader understanding of the historical context that the Christian religion came from. And that's dangerous territory from an apologetic perspective. See, the thing about oral tradition is that what's important is not when it was first written down. I mean, sure, if you can find the date when it was first written down, that tells you something about the very latest date that tradition could have arisen. But what's a lot more important is how long and how far it was circulating before that. And that's a question that genuine historians has a lot of interest in. But maybe what Dr. Craig is referring to is the fact that there's been some relatively recent discoveries like the Nag Hammadi Library that's given historians a lot of new material to talk about. And naturally, the New Testament documents that historians has been studying for the last umpteen centuries is old news by now. So it might seem like the non-canonical documents is getting a lot more press than the canonical ones, but honestly, that ain't too surprising given how picked over the canonical documents is. But here's the ironic thing. The tradition about which books is genuinely inspired scriptures is itself an oral tradition that didn't get formally written down in detail until the late 4th century. When Dr. Craig uses the official church canon to reject 2nd century records of Christian tradition as fake, he's using 4th century records of Christian tradition to do it. And obviously the 2nd century documents is earlier than the 4th century ones. So if we's going to judge records of Christian oral tradition by how early they is, we's really going to need to have a look at them 2nd century documents as being witnesses to what the early traditions was. For example, the canonical Gospels record Jesus telling the Sadducees that in the resurrection they neither marry nor is given in marriage, but they's like the angels in heaven. And in the Bible, maybe you've noticed that the angels is all male. I mean, later on, folks started painting pictures and such showing female angels, but in the Bible, there ain't nowheres that refers to any angels being female. But one of the documents discovered in the Nag Hammadi Library was a collection of the sayings of Jesus called the Gospel of Thomas, which most scholars assign to the 2nd century, but which might have been written as early as 60 CE or as late as 250 CE. And one of the things that the Gospel of Thomas reports Jesus as having said was that part of the salvation of women was that they was going to become male. Apparently that's supposed to be some kind of promotion somehow. But anyways, you have to admit that this is an oral tradition that adds an interesting context to what Jesus said about folks being like angels after the resurrection. It ain't part of the church tradition that was canonized in the late 4th century, but it was an oral tradition circulating among early believers. That kind of makes you wonder what other traditions they were sharing that's got lost over time. But Dr. Craig don't want us paying no attention to what the non-canonical documents has to tell us. Quote, "This is important because all of the radical reconstructions of the historical Jesus in the news today are based on later writings outside the New Testament, in particular the so-called apocryphal Gospels." End quote. And he says that like it's a bad thing to reconsider traditional narratives in the light of new evidence, because that's all that's going on here. Dr. Craig just set up an elaborate straw man to try and make it look like historians was rejecting the New Testament documents and relying exclusively on the non-canonical documents, but that ain't what they's doing. They's just stepping back and looking at the bigger picture. And the bigger picture calls into question some of the traditional dogmas that's been dominant in the church since the early church councils. And Dr. Craig don't like the questions. He makes a big fuss over the fact that these apocryphal Gospels has names like the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter and the Gospel of Philip, even though they weren't actually written by Thomas or Peter or Philip. And it's true that they weren't, but then again, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John neither. Gospel of John, for example, even ends with the words, quote, "This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true." End quote. Who's we? Who is the disciple that wrote these things down? And why is he referred to in the third person? See, we have to remember that in the early church, everything was based on oral tradition, not written scriptures. It ain't that John himself supposedly wrote the Gospel of John, it's that he was supposedly the original source of the oral traditions being recorded in the Gospel. So it still was the Gospel of John, or at least whoever the unnamed disciple was, even though the actual manuscript was put together by whoever we was. And likely the same is true of the Gospels of Peter and Philip and Thomas. They may not have written the actual manuscripts personally, but whoever wrote them down was giving them credit as being the original source. And obviously that don't mean that these Gospels is accurate records of anything that was actually taught by Peter or Philip or Thomas, or for that matter by Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. These witnesses to the oral traditions that was being passed around in the early Christian church, but historians has to bear in mind that sometimes folks believes and shares things that ain't 100% reliable. And that's why a lot of historians has been busy lately looking at the ancient evidence as a whole and trying to work out what's actually true and what's exaggeration and embellishment and, well, early apologetics. So yeah, Dr. Craig is going to find that offensive. And naturally, he's going to do everything he can to try and discredit these kinds of studies. Quote, Professor Luke Johnson, a distinguished New Testament scholar at Emory University, points out that all of the recent spate of books claiming to uncover the real Jesus follow the same predictable pattern. Number one, the book begins by trumpeting the scholarly credentials of the author and his prodigious research. End quote. Let me just interrupt right here because I has to have a little chuckle. Who exactly is it that's pointing out how historians supposedly trumpet their scholarly credentials? Why, bless me, if it ain't Professor Luke Johnson, who is a distinguished New Testament scholar at Emory University. Professor Pot meet Professor Kettle. There ain't nothing wrong with mentioning the academic credentials of the scholar doing the study as long as the study itself is built out of actual verifiable evidence and ain't just a bunch of unsubstantiated claims trying to get by on just the credentials alone. Dr. Craig himself made sure his book contains a couple of interludes that he calls his journey of faith, but that's actually about him getting a couple of doctorates in philosophy and theology. So it might be just a teensy bit biased to accuse modern scholars of trumpeting their credentials just because they mentions them. But let's go on. Quote, Number two, the author claims to offer some new and maybe even suppressed interpretation of who Jesus really was. End quote. And while this phrasing definitely reflects a hostile bias, there is a grain of truth here. Scholarly papers is generally kind of dry and technical and ain't likely to sell well to the general public. Anytime you wants to produce a popular summary of academic research, you has to make it sound interesting. So yeah, there's probably a certain amount of hype going on that ain't the fault of the original academic research. And we should give these books the same skepticism and fact-checking as we do with anything else. Continued. Quote, Number three, the truth about Jesus is said to be discovered by means of sources outside the Bible that enable us to read the Gospels in a new way that is at odds with their face value meaning. End quote. And the implication here is that scholars is misinterpreting what the Bible is saying and maybe even doing so on purpose. But of course that ain't what's going on at all. Nobody is claiming that when the author of Matthew wrote X, he really meant Y. What historians is saying is that the author of Matthew ain't necessarily telling the whole story and ain't necessarily accurate in what he does report. After all, that is literally the historian's job, critically examining ancient reports to try and separate the fact from the fiction. Continuing, quote, Number four, this new interpretation is provocative and even titillating. For example, that Jesus married Mary Magdalene or was the leader of a hallucinogenic cult or a peasant cynic philosopher. End quote. And once again, the phrasing is overtly hostile, but with a grain of truth. In contrast with what historical scholars publish in academic papers, books written for the popular press has to have some kind of hook that's going to make the book sell. And not all popularizers is going to be rigorous in their reporting. But I will say that point number 4 overstates its case. Even the popular books ain't all like that. Once again, we need to give every book the same skepticism and fact-checking as we do with anything else. And finally, quote, number 5, it is implied that traditional Christian beliefs are therefore undermined and need to be revised, end quote. And I hate to break it to Professor Luke Johnson, but Christians themselves has been saying this about Christian traditions they disagree with all the way back to the 1st century. But yes, it's true that when you look at all the evidence from the early centuries of the church, it does undermine the narrative promoted by the dominant group. And that's a good thing. But Dr. Craig is pretty forthright and open about not wanting believers to ever be exposed to any of this evidence. Quote, if you hear of books following this familiar pattern, your critical antennae should automatically go up. You are about to be duped, for the fact is that there is no historically credible source outside the New Testament that calls into question the portrait of Jesus painted in the Gospels, end quote. Or in other words,
oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Even though the canon itself is an oral tradition that weren't written down in detail until the late 4th century, the oral traditions that was documented during the first 3 centuries ain't historically credible. And how do we know? Because Dr. Craig says so. Books by popularizers sometimes contains hype in order to sell more books, and therefore we should reject all the scholarly research that's being done too. Could he be any more blatant about the fact that he's trying to suppress the evidence? Now, I do agree with the notion of keeping your critical antennae up because skepticism is always the best approach to discovering the truth. But the thing about skepticism is that we need to apply it to everything, including our own presuppositions and current beliefs. And that's precisely what Dr. Craig is telling believers not to do. Bunch of bishops got together in the late 4th century and decided which oral traditions was the official teachings of Orthodox Christianity, and believers ain't supposed to entertain any questions about it, period. Which is kind of ironic, because at the beginning of Chapter 8, Dr. Craig was claiming that recent discoveries has completely overthrown modern critical scholarship and vindicated the traditional narrative concerning the New Testament documents. And yet, so far in this chapter, he's focused on trying to persuade believers not to even look at the evidence contained in these recent discoveries. It's almost like maybe he don't care as much about evidence and scholarship as he'd like us to think, and is just focused on driving believers to a predetermined conclusion. And I'm sure there's more that could be said. That's going to about do it for me for today. Next time, he's going to pick up with the question of who has the burden of proof. And surprise, surprise, he's going to claim it's us skeptics. And wait till you see how he tries to argue that one. Meanwhile, thanks for watching, and please be kind wherever possible.